Salam, friends, and welcome to this evening's edition of Book Bites. As much as I love and enjoy memoir, I'm also constantly reminded about the vulnerability and the amount of courage that it takes to write memoir, to write such personal narratives. But tonight's guest has done something more than just remind me, having read Love and Fury these past few days is a reminder of how writing our intimate narratives is an act of politics. It's a political act, it's a personal act. It takes more than just vulnerability and digging deep. And it would be just amazing to now have this opportunity to speak to the author, the autobiographer in this case. And so, a quick introduction before we invite and welcome her to the show. Margie Orford needs very little introduction on the South African and global literary scene. She's internationally acclaimed and an award-winning journalist. Her 5 Clear Heart novels have been widely translated, leading to her being described as the queen of South African crime thriller series. The Weekender. Her most recent novel is The Eye of the Beholder from 2022, while Common Purpose is due to be published next year. A Fulbright scholar, she has a master's in comparative literature from the City University of New York and a PhD in English literature from the University of East Anglia. An honorary fellow of St. Hugh's College, Oxford, she's also an executive board member of PEN International and is currently President Emeritus of PEN South Africa. In addition, she's served as patron of Rape Crisis in Cape Town. Born in England to South African parents, she's lived in Namibia and South Africa and is now based in London, where we will be reaching out to chat to her. Welcome to the show, Margie. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to speak to you, and congratulations on this beautiful memoir.
Thank you, and salam, and happy Sunday evening to everybody in lovely hot South Africa. It's so cold here in London already.
Well, I hope it's inspiring more writing from you. Love and Fury was such a humbling read, such a beautiful, powerful read. And like I said in the quick introduction, reminded, and this we need these reminders of how our personal narratives are an act of, a political act. Speak to us about, and you do speak about it in the memoir as well. Speak about this political act that you've undertaken so successfully and the process of reaching and writing memoir.
Well, the idea of writing as a political act, I think, for women, for people of color, for people who somehow on the margins, particularly of patriarchy or white patriarchy, you giving your account of your life does 2 things. One, it will challenge the ideas of, in my case, ideas of what women should do. But it's also a way of engaging with the sort of power structures that oppress us very often, in which one can so easily internalize as being something wrong with me. There's something wrong with me and why I can't get on with the world. And so I found that, and it became more and more sort of apparent to me that I was writing into a long tradition of women giving an account of their lives, from people like Audre Lorde to Toni Morrison, Simone de Beauvoir, closer to home in South Africa, people like Noni Chubavu and others. So you tell your life, by telling your life, what I thought I was doing, and maybe this is a good way of explaining it, I see memoir writing as a kind of opening up the home of yourself. It's opening up the house of yourself and inviting people in. So then for me, the laws of hospitality apply in that you've got to feed people, look after them, entertain them. They can maybe be frightened or moved, but ultimately they must go from the house of yourself kind of replenished. But it took me a long time to get to understand that, yes, it's both a political act to give an account of oneself, especially if you're talking about experiences of violence or particularly that, but that also you're giving a place in which and this has certainly been in the reception of the memoir, a place in which other women can find a place to be, other people can find a similarity and kind of a rapport with the experiences that you've described. And I just love memoir. I read so many in the last few years, and it was just, I don't know, I love the generosity of memoir writers, and I try to reciprocate.
And I think you've definitely done that successfully, because allowing a window into your world takes a great amount of courage, as I've said. But at the same time, that generosity comes through because it allows us to draw those bridges of understanding and empathy when reading these stories. Our collective story is something that allows us to heal together. And the story very much, I mean, you document the sort of burden of the domestic duty that we take on as women, but you're able to stand back and actually witness it. And you talk about writing as witnessing our lives. So we both writing and reading memoir is so much of witnessing the traumas, the challenges, but also the triumphs and getting through those spaces. Speak to us about some of these challenges, being able to give voice to them, but also allowing the writing to be a kind of a vehicle for healing through the abandonment trauma or dealing with patriarchy, and all of the themes that come through sort of in this way, the microaggressions and the sort of visible aggressions that occur.
Yeah, I think I think what I was trying to reach, and it took me long to realize what I was doing, because I started writing this book 2017, 2018, or I started writing pieces of what would become the book. And I couldn't write anything. I got divorced in 2015 after a very, very long marriage, 25, 26 years, and my three daughters from that marriage. And the kind of implosion of that relationship was, as anyone who's gone through a divorce or a breakup, I'm sure will relate to, was absolutely devastating to me. I'd fallen pregnant kind of unintentionally, I suppose, when I was quite young and got married, and I loved the person I got married, but I was also very young and didn't know myself or him or how to be a woman in my own terms. So then one pulls towards oneself all the kind of rules of what one thinks a woman should do, what a mother should be. So I lived longer and longer with this kind of dissonance between who I was, who I am, and what I thought I should be doing. But when the marriage, and I sort of called it, it was, I don't know, I mean, it's the loneliest place, an unhappy marriage, or a marriage in which you can't grow or be or feel sort of in communion with somebody. But I was completely devastated by the loss of it. And I realized that much of I mean, I'd been a feminist since I was sort of 16 or 17 years old, but my feeling of a frame and a place in the world was very much enmeshed with this, the social structure of a marriage, the sort of edifice of it, the protection it gives you, all of that sort of thing. Anyway, so I'd left, come to England. I had all this sort of triumph career-wise. I had all these wonderful fellowships and things, but I was completely at sea, completely sort of like broken apart. And I actually started writing. I sort of start the book, and this is just a little warning. I kept on wanting to not be there, which I suppose was an idea of kind of suicide. I just wanted to disappear. And I kept on writing. It was the one thing I've never been able to write. And this is the point at which I start the memoir, was trying to write a suicide note, and I couldn't write it. I couldn't write it. Every time I would get jumped up and I would get up and I wouldn't be able to do this. It took me years to realize that the creativity, my capacity to write, which for me is my capacity to be a person, had intervened somehow, was saving me. And I think all of us, when we reach despair, if you listen, this is what I've learned in retrospect, you listen to the thing that interrupts that thought. It's the part of you and the loving people that you've had in your life who are saying to you, no, there's another way, there's another way. And my way was to write the story of my life in order to try and understand it. So a memoir is in many ways healing, but it's not therapeutic. I'm sure some of you will have read, people listening will have read a memoir where you think, okay, this is, the writer's got a lot of problems and I wish she'd sort them out first and then come to me with a story. There are two strands. There's the therapy and the thinking and the getting help, and then the writing is making a story out of your situation. It's telling a story, and where you know what the story is and you know who you are, who's telling the story, then you can listen and even write some of the most harrowing things, because you, the writer, me, the writer, was no longer in the grip of those things. I had come to understand them, the sort of complexity of relationships, of being a mother, of having a complicated career, of being born into a very patriarchal South African family and adapting to all of and resisting those things. And often you have to resist most the people you love the most, you know, like the men in your family. So I think in that process of writing, you start off, the arc is you start off telling your own story. The end of the arc, by the time it goes out where people can read it, the person that you have in mind, or the people you have in mind, are the people who are going to read it. And I did think, I want women who've gone through this experience, many of the experiences that I've had, which I know in South Africa are many, of broken relationships, in other situations of sexual violence, of recovery, of being fashioning a career for yourself and really believing in your right to that, to shine and to take up space, which the patriarchy will tell you you may not do. You must speak quietly and sit in the corner, and you just say, no, I'm going to sit at my place at the table. That's the person that you have in mind. And the reader comes, the person you're talking to in your book comes more and more into focus, say, in the editing process, and where you're moving the book away from the kind of inside of you into something which other people can inhabit. But I have to, so I hoped, and this has been the case, in which many women have responded to the book, that either at events or they've written to me and said, you've really, and they will choose different aspects of it. But they have said, you've spoken our lives, you've told our story, and it will be different things. And that's the most wonderful feeling for a writer. But what has been so striking, what I didn't expect, is how many men have written to me, of all ages, of all backgrounds, of all classes, and have said to me, you've helped me understand the women in my life. You've helped me. My wife, say, for example, one guy wrote to me, he said, my wife was sexually assaulted. She was raped, and many years ago, and she's told me, but he said, your book made me understand what she lived with. And I found that deeply touching and moving, because it's kind of counter to so much of what we think of in a very violent and patriarchal society like South Africa is, like what we're seeing in the United States with this election going on now, this deep misogyny. And I thought, so many men want to know what it is, and some of them wrote to me, and I loved them for that.
And I mean, while you're speaking, I'm thinking about, relatability, because while you're being vulnerable and writing your story and, putting your story out there, which is incredibly personal, and dealing with how to resolve some of the sort of issues that you may have dealt with along the way, there are people reading this and saying, well, we're not alone. And I think that raw emotion that you display on the page is exactly what brings about this relatability. So I often think of memoir, and yours definitely comes through that way, as holding up the mirror to yourself, because you really have to take a deep look at yourself, but also reflecting back at society, and society is able to say, but this is how we've behaved, this is what we've done to each other under the auspices of love and good intentions. This and this and this is what actually happens between us, men and women, and in various sort of situations within a violent and patriarchal society. So you talk about writing as dissociative practice. I'm paraphrasing it.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed how you talk about writing as dissociative practice, but also as deeply productive because of that. So the love and the fury, the rage with which your writing is propelled forward. Give us a taste of and a sense of that, because it comes through in different ways, and how you're able to produce by releasing this rage.
So I suppose I've sort of been driven by two very powerful feelings. So one is love of other people. Maybe at times not enough love for myself, but I think love is a underestimated emotion. It's usually used in just in a sort of a romantic sense, and that absolutely has been important to me in my life, being in love with people. But it's a very powerful emotion, and it's linked to fury. So the fury, from when I was a little girl, I don't know why, I was just born with this thing. It makes me so angry and furious to see other people suffer, to see suffering. It really, I think all children have that. Children have an innate sort of morality and a sort of sense of outrage at aggression. They don't like it. It bothers them. And I think that outrage is linked to the sort of natural way of loving and being together. So those were very important emotions to me. I think what happened to me growing up as a little white child, white South African, is that many things I witnessed, and I talk about some of these in the memoir. I was told that I had seen it wrong. I describe an awful scene I witnessed as a little girl, a little black boy my age, being whipped on a farm that we were visiting. And it's absolutely seared into my mind. And I've always thought that was the time where I decided I became a writer or a witness. I thought it was so important that I tell the tale. And, kids are always told, don't tell tales. You get in trouble for telling tales. And I think that one of the most important things we can do is to tell the tale of what happened. But the beginning of a real split in myself, and I imagine I'm not the only person who has that, is to witness something that I knew was profoundly wrong, and then to be told it must be happening for a reason, which I couldn't understand, or I couldn't have seen what I saw, or I shouldn't have left the house and gone wandering around and then seen this thing that was taboo to see and to look at. We can take that attitude and think about how people are responding to what's happening in Gaza, for instance, on the political realm. But that thought of witnessing, and there was an impotence in there, because I saw that thing. I told my parents, they told me I must have made it up, or I shouldn't have got all of those things. And I think I realized at that time that you still have to tell the tale, even if it makes no difference. You can't not tell just because I expected my telling to cause action. And I've retained that naive belief in a way that by telling the tale, justice will prevail somehow, or you will have represented something that otherwise would have completely slipped away. So you kind of have
everyone to have the same sense of justice that you have.
Pardon?
You expect everyone to have the same sense of justice that you have.
Yes, I think they should. Yes, I do think that they should. I think people find different ways to act on it. I think people often don't often the response you get when you do have a sense of justice is very hostile and aggressive. It certainly was, as we know, during apartheid in South Africa. It was the truth teller would be punished because, you know what I mean, it had to be pretended, it had to be something else. But I was thinking with the vulnerability and how one manages it with the writing. One incident I describe in the book, and I'm sure many women or girls who are listening will relate to this. I describe being sexually assaulted at a school dance. So in the pilots, nothing really happened, but everything happened in a way. I mean, it took me, I'd never told that story until I wrote this memoir. And the vulnerability that one gets is, I'm not 15 anymore. I just turned 60. So I'm definitely not 15. But I wrote that scene, and I'd always known exactly what had happened at this dance with this awful guy who was arranged as my blind date. Horrible situation. And he just took a chance in that sort of casual buffet, grabbing at any girl who happens to be there. I'll just have this one because she's just there in that, that kind of mindset. So I wrote it down, and it happened. About a few hours later, I started to shake. I felt sick for days. I was sick. And I thought, this is because I've written this thing. Like in that book by Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score. My body had suppressed the response, not the memory, but the physical response, until I did something about it, until I wrote it down and really sort of could say exactly what had happened and no longer be ashamed of myself. Because I realized what silences women so much, men too, actually, but for different reasons. What silences us is shame. I was so ashamed that had happened to me. I was so ashamed to have been treated like rubbish. And I thought, the shame is not mine. The person who was shameful was that boy, that young man, and the shame was all his. And it was so weird how this, the sort of shaking and being sick and throwing up and going back to the writing, it was like it had left me. And now I can read that little piece when I read it, and I can feel immense sympathy, and I can feel sorry for that child I was, who that was done to. Which enables me to really, I could always feel sorry for other people. I'm sorry, I don't mean that in a patronizing sense at all. I could feel desperately sorry that it had ever happened and wanted to unhappen it. But it was so striking to me how long it takes to integrate those experiences, to integrate those feelings. And one of the ways is writing is one of the ways in which we can. And reading.
We talk about relationships and marriage as having someone to witness your life, and sometimes it just shows that two people can grow with love but grow apart. And at the same time, what you've done is written your own sort of witness document by witnessing yourself in your own life, and there's power in that. So there's these anecdotal incidences that you have of various experiences in your life, and there's resolution in the way that you've written the book, but there's also this power and empowerment in how you've been able to witness various aspects of your life and say, well, look, it wasn't your fault. Say to little you, it wasn't your fault.
Yeah.
Whatever happened was not your fault. It's such an important reference point for so many men and women and, people reading from different perspectives. Would you encourage more memoir writing? I see there seems to be a resurgence in the last few years.
There is a big
what would you say to
resurgence.
someone who wanted to write their story?
I would encourage them, yes. And I just before I will give you some good reason. I wanted to say I'm a bit slow. It took me 6 novels, writing novels, to realize I also had to write my own story. I'd written around and around and around it. But so by the time I wrote my own story, 2 things happened. One, it's got a lot of pace, which is absolutely not how my life has felt to me. But I'd written so many novels, it gets that sort of like momentum. But in the writing of fiction, I'd come through the stories of other people. I mean, anyone who's read my thriller, my South African series, the Clare Hart series, I'm dealing with the crime of South Africa and how it's resolved and sort of sorted out through Ridwan Faisal and Clare Hart, my 2 leads. But it did dawn on me that I needed to understand what it was that was driving me to do this work, like why I wrote compulsively over and over and over and over again about violence. I mean, it is obvious South Africa is an extremely violent society. We had the violence of apartheid and the long civil war before that, colonialism, slavery on top, like it's layers of violence which has shaped us all. And for me, writing the memoir was a way of understanding and finding my place in that system, in that world that's shaped me, and in the sort of in Namibia as well, where I've spent a lot of my life. But something very uncanny, and this comes to your question about is it a worthwhile endeavor? A couple of weeks ago, I did a reading for PEN South Africa, actually, and I was reading with Ankie Kroch and Yvette Christianse and me and 2 other women. So we were reading, and I read one chapter in which I described doing some work in the book. I think it was chapter 40 in the memoir, about going to the Salt River mortuary and seeing this little girl had been murdered, and the sort of it kind of links back in the how memory works in my memoir. It's like kind of like a spiral. So you'll have an event and it will take you back down to another one and another one. And I see all these, pull up these connections. And I read it and I thought, this is the thought I had. I said, she was writing the truth. So I was thinking of myself as she, and then it was the most ecstatic experience because I could read the chapter and I thought she wrote absolutely the true version of events and of memory. And then I had the feeling of like, I've put that self down. I am no longer disrupted by that trauma, which repeated over and over and over, as we know trauma does. And it was the most amazing and liberating feeling. I didn't expect it. I thought that I've understood that, and it's no longer the thing that's driving me. I know it. I've contained it. I've put it down. It's not a secret, and I can do other things now. It was amazing.
I found it so interesting how you're able to talk about the fiction along with the writing process. So you actually allow us to get inside your head while you're envisioning and working through the fiction. Margie, we have run out of time.
Oh,
I'm so grateful that we had the opportunity to get into your process and some of the greater details. I would have loved more time. And I know that whoever reads this, it's not just a proudly South African story, but that there's so many ways in which you bring about these kinds of connections between the personal and the political. And we wish you everything of the best with this book and with future writing as well. Thanks again for giving us your time this evening.
Thank you very much, and wonderful to be with you.
And so there you have it. We spoke to Margie Orford about Love and Fury, her memoir. Please look out for her range of crime fiction series. And that's it from us this evening on BookBytes. Assalamu alaikum from us and the team.